gaan KhoiSan koere. I've come to take you home. I've come to take you home. Home. Remember the veld, the lush green grass beneath the big oak trees. The air is cool there, and the sun does not burn.
The story of Sarah Bartman, an indigenous Khoi Khoi woman who was taken from her country of birth in 1810 and paraded on European stages as part of a freak show, became a catalyst for the revival of Khoi Khoi dignity and pride.
I have made your bed at the foot of the hill. Your blankets are covered in buchu and mint.
She died a lonely death in Paris in 1816, and her body parts were kept in jars in the museum. After lengthy negotiations with the French government, the remains of Sarah were brought back in 2002 to be buried in her ancestral home.
Sarah Bartman gave us as women a spiritual connectedness that we did not know existed. And to me, that is so positive. The fact that to us, she became the icon of our spiritual connectedness.
It was time for the rebirth of Khoi Khoi identity, a people until recently described as extinct. This is the story of Sarah Bartman and her people, the Khoi Khoi herders of Southern Africa. Around the time of the birth of Christ, Khoi Khoi herders lived in territories all along the Cape Coast, as far east as the Great Fish River and northwest across the Harib or Orange River. They lived here with large flocks of fat-tailed sheep with luxuriant pastures, bringing stability and wealth, until a new force arrived, not from the interior of Africa, but from a people that came from a distant and completely different civilization. The pre-colonial history of the Khoi Khoi is not easy to tell because there are no written records except for rock art and archaeological remains.
As historians, we are challenged by trying to recreate a very distant past, the past of the 17th and 18th century. Largely, we base our evidence on records which were generated and written by officials of the Dutch East India Company. So right from the start, one must be aware that there is, of course, a bias in these records. These bias reflect the official view of the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company.
History is written by the conquerors, and that is how we got our own history. The victors, the conquerors, the colonialists wrote history from their perspective, never from the perspective of the people who were on the land. And that colored our whole approach to history in South Africa.
In this film, we are bringing a fresh perspective and a new narrative, using oral records archaeological evidence, and re-examining the old diaries and reports for clues to the truth. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Khoi Khoi arrived in the Cape about 2,000 years ago. But where did they come from? For many years, historians were puzzled by their origin, and there were many theories.
The research around the origin of the Khoi Khoi has been going on for many, many years. Archaeologists, historians, linguists, anthropologists, and geneticists became involved. The geneticists have set up a genetic tree of humankind with all these branches. The lowest branch, in other words, the oldest branch, and a sub-branch of that branch is called the LOD, and that is the oldest example of humanity, and that's where the Khoi belong, and also the Bushmen in this country. Because of the migration history and the development of Khoi as such, when they intermingled with the Bushmen in northern Botswana and eventually down, they actually share, do the Khoi and the Bushmen, a common gene pool. If you look at the genome of a descendant of either of those people, you'll find their similarities.
One of the richest archaeological sites is found off the Cape's west coast, just north of Saldanha Bay, at a place called Kasteelberg.
We found very good evidence of groups living on the Vredenburg Peninsula on the west coast, the site of Kasteelberg. And Kasteelberg was occupied between probably around 1800 years ago until about 800 years ago. For 1,000 years, people came back seasonally. In fact, it is the richest site we know of the Khoi. And one reason we found it is because they were living on the coast and collecting shellfish. We've only found one skeleton at Kasteelberg. It was a young girl. She was from the south. She has a Cape signature. The northern groups in the Kalahari had different DNA to those living in the Cape. North of Kasteelberg, at a place called Foreskop, we've got DNA which relates to DNA from northern Malawi. We've got the connection of the Khoi with Tanzania. There's a group called the Sandawi, who are Click speakers, who are also probably connected genetically to people of the Cape. People coming in from the north probably took local wives.
Centuries ago, there was not that wave, but rather very, very lengthy movement of different groups of pastoralists who were once upon a time hunter-gatherers.
The main reason for migration is that as the communities grew, became bigger, they looked for new pasture, they would hive off, they would become a split. So a senior son of the chief would move off with one clan and then go and establish in a new area. But this took time over hundreds and hundreds of years. It wasn't a sudden trek that everybody packed up and now we're migrating south.
This is the same method that the indigenous people used a long time ago. Similar structures, sometimes it can be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. It all depends on the group also and the availability of material. And the mats, it was very practical, as you can roll up and it will take you about 2 hours, even less if you know the skill, less than 2 hours to construct something like this.
This is where the mighty Harib and the Vaal River come together. It is thought that it is somewhere here that the Khoi Khoi herders crossed and then followed the Siakwi River south into the Karoo.
A fairly acceptable theory is that they came down the Siakwi River because that part of the Karoo is quite arid, it's very dry, but the Siakwi River was a kind of corridor south.
It is here, in the heart of the Cape Karoo, that we find evidence of the presence of Khoi Khoi herders.
Ons is so 50 kilometers noord van Beaufort West op die dorpie Nelspoort. En ons is hier in die galery wat geskep is deur die San en die Khoi. Nou wat ons hier het op die klip is tipiese tekeninge of grafiere van die Khoi mense. En hulle teken altyd in sirkelvormige figure. Hierdie is 'n pragtige tekening met 'n sirkel met uitgekerfde patrone. Hulle het dit gedoen natuurlik met klip. Dit is simbolies van aarde. Dit is meestal son of sirkelvormige uitgegraveerde prente op die klip.
Drawings similar to those can be found all over southern Africa, and also here in the south of Namaqualand, in the area known as die Knersvlakte.
Hier oral op hierdie klippe en areas is daar gravering wat gemaak is, en dit is duidelik dat hierdie gravering deur my voorouers, die Khoi Khoi en die San gemaak is. Baie van hierdie graverings is aanduidings dat dit moontlik presente was wat in tye van die hokmeisie aan die meisies oorhandig is, soos die velsakke, krale, en dan is daar ook moontlike graverings wat lyk soos slange, wat direk verband hou met die hokmeisie, want die hokmeisie gaan dit ook oor die waterslang wat in hierdie ritueel gebruik is.
After crossing the Cape Mountains, they reached the east coast. One group continued east as far as the Fish River. Others continued west until they reached the Cape. Some even continued into the Northern Cape. Archaeological evidence proves that the Khoi Khoi lived around the Cape coastal belt 1,800 years ago.
The pre-colonial period offers us very little written information about the Khoi Khoi. Shell middens, such as this, however, provide us with a picture about the lifestyle of these early inhabitants. Shell middens are like ancient household rubbish dumps, and what we throw away says a lot about us. From this midden, we can see what the Khoi Khoi ate, the tools they used, and how they stored their food and their water.
We're at Still Bay, and the mouth of the Khoi Khoi River is almost just a kilometer or so away from us. But all along the shore, you have these interesting patterns, sort of rocks arranged in semicircles or half circles, if you like. Now, these were built many, many years ago by the early Khoi Khoi of this area, and they're called fish traps.
Professor Michael de Jong spent many years studying one of the groups along the South Cape coastline near Swellendam, the Khoi Khoi Hesekwas, and made some interesting discoveries.
We sampled over 160 people and found that the fingerprint, the DNA fingerprint of Khoi was definitely there. We went back literally to each individual and gave them personal, confidential feedback in terms of their genetic profile. The dominating percentage was Khoi Khoi.
Today, all Khoi Khoi descendants are classified as colored, a political move by the colonial and apartheid governments effectively stripping Khoi Khoi descendants of any claims to land by changing their name and cutting them from their native roots.